Anthony Albanese, as many of you know, is the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Tourism, and more recently... Are you ready, or do you want me to talk longer, Albo? And more recently, and with much support and applause from the bus industry and the Parliamentary Friendship Group for Cities, and the members of Anthony's own Urban Dialogue Group, which is looking at a whole range of issues, applauded the ALP for adopting a cities portfolio, which we think should effectively be a portfolio that's adopted by all the political parties. In fact, we think that the issue of cities, moving people and public transport should be a bipartisan issue based purely and simply on the importance of our cities to our economy. If the federal government doesn't have a role in making sure that our economy is functioning properly, then it really does need to be involved in cities, because they are the knowledge drivers of our economy today. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Anthony.
Well, thanks very much, and it's good to be here. Would have been good to have a sort of sit down for 5 minutes, but I'm always up for talking public transport without notice. So can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country, pay my respect to their elders past and present. Can I acknowledge my parliamentary colleague, Michael McCormack, who's a good bloke in spite of his choice of political parties, and my other parliamentary colleagues who are here that I don't know who's here because I haven't been here for as long as you. So I'll just acknowledge you one and all. Oh, there's Darren Chester, who's also a good bloke. I don't know what it is about the Nats. They elected me deputy leader a little while ago at their end-of-year party. I'll say this about the Nats. They have the best Christmas parties of any political party, including my own. Look, former US President Abraham Lincoln once made a very important observation about the burden of leadership. He said, "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." Not a bad rule for people who offer themselves up for national leadership. The fact is that a deferral of engagement in issues of public transport and infrastructure means that it's harder to get it right down the track. It's not a matter of picking up the pieces, it makes it harder. And for that reason, I'm absolutely committed to the principles that are consistent that have been promoted by BIC over many years, and hence my long association with your organisation. The fact is that if you're going to have a national government, it has to be engaged in our cities. Our cities produce 80% of our GDP. Our cities are where between 75 and 80% of Australians live. So you have to be engaged in regional Australia. Part of your cities policy, by the way, has to be to take pressure off your capital cities, particularly on the eastern seaboard, by the growth of regional cities. It's not either or, it's both. If you have a policy that says you're just engaged in the regions and not involved in the cities, then inevitably that will not only cause a detrimental impact on our cities, it will also be detrimental to our regional cities and regional economic growth, and therefore national economic growth. Just the same as if you have a view that says that the national government has a role to play in roads but not in public transport, that is an absurd proposition. I heard Joe Hockey say something similar just a week ago and was disappointed by it. I understand the current Prime Minister's view, and he's outlined his ideological view in battle lines, where he says there aren't enough people at who want to go from a particular destination to another particular destination at a particular time to justify anything than a motor car, and motor cars need roads. But Joe Hockey a couple of weeks ago said that in a speech in Melbourne that he agreed that urban policy essentially wasn't the national government's business. I think this is a discussion that we have to have as a nation. We cannot, in my view, grow as a nation unless we have national leadership, and that has to be holistic national leadership. It has to acknowledge that everything is connected to everything else. You can't view things in silos. So, for example, the view that if the Commonwealth retreats from investment in urban rail projects, then that space will be occupied by state governments isn't right. Because if you're a state treasurer and you have a road project and a rail project, and if you pick the road project, you'll get, in the case of the current government, for $1 million, you'll get $4 million of co-investment from the feds. If you pick the rail project, you'll get nothing. You'd have to be a complete nong, frankly, to choose the rail project. And it will distort the market over a period of time. It will distort the way that we deal with urban congestion. And it's happening already. It is happening already. Badgerys Creek Airport is a bipartisan position. I pay tribute to the fact that the federal government has been prepared to take the decision, taking the research that we did, but it has taken courage to do that. They've also invested in the roads around that airport, but they don't have a rail line. You can't have an international airport without a rail line, which is somewhere in, to the west of suburban Sydney. In spite of what some of the critics of Badgerys Creek have to talk about, it is actually nowhere near Parramatta, that's closer to Kingsford Smith Airport, Blacktown and Liverpool, next to those urban communities. You can't expect people from overseas to fly into an international airport that's got more cows and horses around it than it's got people, and there's no public transport system to get them anywhere. So this is the sort of policy distortion that is created by a view about public transport which in my view is very narrow-minded. When it comes to the bus industry, we need to look at areas of best practice. There are parts of Brisbane that are best practice, parts of northwest Sydney that are best practice in terms of bus lanes and making sure that buses play the critical role that they can play. I'm concerned in terms of somewhere like the light rail line that's being put in the eastern suburbs of Sydney down Anzac Parade. The bus system actually works pretty well. Like, buses are actually very effective at moving people from where they want to go to where they want to go at a particular time. The system works pretty well. So we need to have a view of public transport, whether it be rail, light rail or buses, that in my view acknowledges that you simply will not solve urban congestion in Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, let alone Perth or Adelaide, without having a public transport policy. And you won't get a public transport policy without national leadership from the government because of the distortions that are there in terms of state governments that are under pressure in terms of their ability to invest and a capacity to engage by themselves. They will go inevitably with the short-termism that comes from the hit of turning an old sod, even if it's not going to resolve the long-term issues of urban congestion. I'm an old-fashioned Uranite, as many of you will know, and we said farewell to Tom earlier this year, the mentor of myself, not just politically, but very much on a personal level as well. One of the things that struck me about that was the messages I received from across Australia. I received messages from people who are certainly not Labor supporters in regional communities, who appreciated his support for regional development, from people in communities that have been saved, literally, by opposing freeways running through Sydney, through the Glebe estate and places like that would have been trashed, and by someone who had, I think, a vision of urban and regional development that supported urban public transport, that supported regional economic development, that stood, I guess, apart from some of the noise of politics. That I think the noise of modern politics has got far worse. And it's a concern of mine that at a time when a range of things should be bipartisan, like we should have, why does a major cities unit get abolished on day one of a new government? It's an absurd decision to make. So now we don't have, I met with a reasonable sized company today, Lendlease. They got a fair bit of dough to invest in this country. They said to me, what's happened to the State of Australian Cities reports? Because that was critical. You need evidence-based decision-making. You need data to know where people are moving, what cities are looking like, what suburbs are looking like. And yet we don't have that. Too often in terms of our planning, the idea, state elections come and go. People say, what's the solution? Let's just release more land. Let's not talk about how people get to work. Let's not talk about where the jobs are. Let's not talk about health and education infrastructure. We need to do much better than that. We need to have a holistic approach to planning that engages all levels of government, that acknowledges that one of the problems that the last State of Australian Cities report identified, released 2 years ago, was the emergence of drive-out suburbs, something that BIC has led the way on in terms of the concept of 20-minute cities. How do we make sure that we don't just continue to grow housing, the disconnect between where housing is growing and where jobs are growing, the nature of our economy? You can't, press the pause button on the economy and hold on to everything that we've had in the past. Jobs will change. What are the jobs of the future? Where will they be located? How do we make sure that people can have access to those jobs so that we don't have a circumstance whereby we have people who can't afford to live anywhere near where they work? And the social consequences behind drive-in, drive-out suburbs whereby people spend more time in their car going to and from work than they do at home with their kids has a real social policy implication that we need to deal with. These are things that shouldn't be partisan. They're not Labor or Liberal or National or Green. They should be bipartisan. We should be prepared to have a mature discussion as a nation about where we're going to go. The intergenerational report didn't mention cities, released 2 weeks ago, didn't mention climate change, didn't mention any of the big challenges that are there. It just made sort of predictions of what Australia would look like in 40 years without connecting a pathway. It's the role of people of goodwill, and I accept there are people of goodwill here of different political persuasions. Darren and Michael are good people who are in politics for all the same reason I am, might have a different perspective. But how do you get a circumstance whereby we can work together in a way that isn't one of conflict all the time and adversarial? And to me, that is something that we need to do. And it's something that your organisation, I know, has tried to promote. It's something we're trying to promote through the urban policy dialogue that we've established. There's an appetite out there. And, politically, it's in my interest to say the government should continue to say there's no role for the national government in cities, because that opens up a huge chasm that you don't have to be a South Sydney premiership winning forward to run through. You know, even a Manly player could run through that hole. So, yeah, in terms of a way forward, I think that we need to acknowledge also the linkage between the false dichotomy that's there between moving freight and people as well. That's another sort of falsehood that's put up. You know, one of the issues in our cities of congestion is that the freight lines had to be separated from the passenger lines. One of the things that happens on our roads is if we have effective rail freight, then it takes trucks off the roads that make it easier to have bus lanes and to have lanes that can get people from A to B. I gave a speech at the National Press Club just next door last year where I outlined a 10-point plan for cities and urban policy. At the risk of, as long as you don't tell my speechwriter, you can just tell him that I mentioned it tonight. I won't go through it all, but I'd encourage you to have a look at it. I'd rather tonight, I guess, at a dinner function like this, talk about where we're coming from, and I think I've tried to do that. The thing is, as well, that, and I'll leave you with this thought, when we actually have proper economic analysis through Infrastructure Australia, looking at cost-benefit, public transport does pretty well. There's still a bit of a debate that I think's been abandoned last Friday about the East-West Link in Victoria that has a cost-benefit analysis of 0.45, a 45 cents return for every dollar. Any private sector player here, particularly a CFO, who presents to your board a proposal for any investment that will produce 45 cents for every dollar return, wouldn't bother even presenting it. And yet we had $3 billion allocated in last year's budget, $1.5 billion of it as an advance payment at a time where I'm told that we're in a budget crisis and money's short. Money's not short for some things. Money needs to be prioritised, though, appropriately, according to cost-benefit analysis. That's the way to depoliticise some of the infrastructure investment debate. Because, you know, I think there's common agreement that infrastructure is the key to economic growth and productivity, and that we need to do it. But we need to get it right. We need to invest in road, invest in rail, invest in the right projects at the right time with the right dollars. And those decisions shouldn't be based upon the margin of a political seat. They should be based upon the contribution to the national economy. If we do that, then that can be a big step forward in terms of consensus. I began with a quote from Abe Lincoln, and he also said, and I'll conclude with this, he said, "The best thing about the future is it comes one day at a time." Well, it's not too late for the government to step up in terms of urban policy. Tomorrow they could do it and change it. It would be pretty smart to say that, you know, along with there are other changes that have been made, to say that, you know, they don't even have to say they were wrong, but they do need to say that the idea that the federal government has no role in urban policy and no role in public transport is just a bit silly, frankly, and a bit counterproductive. And I think on that basis, you know, we could move forward in a way that cements the right investment going and ends some of the fake debates that are there: urban, regional, rail, road, freight, passenger. You know, we can do better than that, I think, as a country. And I think that you all have a role to hold us as decision makers, all of us who have made mistakes, to account for the role that we play. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. No, that's good. Well, you can relax now since you're here for the night. Watch out for my chairman you're sitting next to, though. He'll lead you astray. But thanks, Albo. Main will be shortly served, and then we'll hear from Michael McCormick. So have a drink and enjoy your evening.